A photograph from 1897, showing a lone boy standing, holds a terrifying secret. 128 years later, researchers zoom in on the image, and what they find changes everything. In a forgotten corner of the Westbrook Historical Society, a photograph was discovered, seemingly innocent at first glance. A boy, no older than 10, stands alone in front of a grand Victorian mansion. His face is expressionless, his posture rigid, as though he's waiting for something or someone. But what appeared to be an ordinary portrait turned into a haunting mystery when researchers began examining the photo more closely. At first, no one thought much of the image. It was just another piece of history. But when Elellanar, a dedicated archivist, zoomed in on the photograph using modern digital technology, strange things began to happen. The boy's eyes, once dull and lifeless, seemed to shift, following her every move. His surroundings, once still, began to reveal strange, impossible details, things no one had ever noticed before. The photograph began to pulse with an eerie energy, and that's when the unsettling truth started to emerge. The boy was not just a figure captured in time. He was a ghostly presence, one that had been waiting for over a century to reveal his secrets. What had happened to him? Why was he standing alone, frozen in time? Grave of the Shadows invites you to uncover the chilling truth behind this mysterious photograph. As the story unfolds, Elellanar and her colleague James will dive deep into the past to unravel a tale of tragedy, darkness, and a haunting force that refuses to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and hit the bell icon for more spine-chilling mysteries from the past. In the dimly lit basement of the Westbrook Historical Society, Elellanar Blackwood adjusted her glasses and stared at the photograph before her. The image, taken in 1897, had been discovered during a routine archival sorting, tucked away in an old, dusty box marked unclassified. At first glance, the black and white photo appeared harmless, just another portrait of a child from a bygone era. The boy stood alone in front of an imposing mansion, his expression neutral, his posture stiff and formal, as children of that time often were. But something about the photograph unnerved her. It wasn't the boy's distant gaze or the somber backdrop. No, it was something far subtler. The more Elellanar looked at the photo, the more she felt an unexplainable chill. It wasn't until she began scanning it into the digital system that she realized there was more to this picture than met the eye. The photograph, though aged, had been remarkably well preserved. Yet, as the image appeared on her computer screen, Elellanar noticed something unusual. The boy's eyes seemed to follow her, an impossible detail that shouldn't have been there. She shook her head, attributing it to the dim lighting of the room and her tired eyes. But when she zoomed in further, the boy's figure started to shift in strange ways. His smile, once faint, began to twist into something far more sinister. What was going on? The photo shouldn't have been capable of such movement. It was as if the photograph was alive, and in that moment, Elellanar knew that something was wrong. This wasn't just an old relic from the past. It was a key to something far darker, something hidden beneath layers of time. Determined to uncover the truth, Elellanar enlisted the help of her colleague, James Mitchell, an expert in historical anomalies. Together, they would begin a journey that would lead them to a haunting discovery, one that would change their lives forever. Grave of the Shadows invites you to follow Elellanar and James as they uncover the dark secret hidden within the photograph. But beware, the more they uncover, the more they realize some secrets are never meant to be found. The moment Elellanar zoomed in on the photograph for the second time, the unease that had been building in her chest deepened. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, something her mind was conjuring in the quiet of the basement. But the more she stared at the boy in the image, the more impossible it seemed to ignore the subtle changes happening before her eyes. The boy's face, once expressionless, now held a faint smile, one that stretched unnaturally across his lips. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child posing for a picture. It was a smile that felt deliberate, as though he were trying to communicate something beyond the frame. The shadows around him seemed to darken, creeping inward as if they were pulling him deeper into the photograph, and the house behind him, which had appeared perfectly still, began to shift. Elellanor's hand trembled as she adjusted the zoom again. That's when she saw it. Just beneath the boy's feet. A shadow, faint at first, but growing more distinct with each passing moment. It wasn't cast by the boy or the mansion. It was something else. Something that seemed to belong to no one at all. She couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, even as she stared at the screen. The room, once calm, now felt suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the scanner, which seemed to grow louder as the image on her screen became clearer. And then, as the boy's figure shifted once again, Elellanar felt a cold gust of air brush against her skin, despite the room being sealed off from any drafts. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to see this." As she called her colleague over, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for them to discover the truth hidden within the photograph. James Mitchell approached the desk, his footsteps echoing in the quiet basement. Elellanar didn't look up, still staring at the screen, her eyes fixed on the photograph of the boy. The image had become more unsettling with each passing moment. The shadows behind the boy seemed to move of their own accord, swirling around him like an invisible force was pulling him deeper into the photograph. As James peered over her shoulder, his breath caught. "What the hell is going on here?" James muttered, rubbing his eyes as if to shake off the fatigue. "It's just a picture, right?" Elellanar didn't respond right away. She was too absorbed in the strange details unfolding before her. She had enlarged the photograph further, examining the boy's face, and now it was clear. His eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on her. It felt like he was watching her, not just through the lens of the photo, but through something deeper. It was as though his gaze reached beyond the two-dimensional image, locking onto her very soul. "This isn't just some random historical photo," Elellanar said, her voice shaking. "Something's happening with it. Look at the way his eyes are following me. It's impossible." James leaned in, scanning the image with a skeptical frown. "It's an old photo, Elellanar. The lighting could be playing tricks on you. Old photos, well, they can look eerie when you zoom in, especially with old technology. You've been staring at it too long." But Elellanar wasn't convinced. The feeling in her chest, a cold, creeping sensation, was growing stronger. She was familiar with the oddities of old photos, dust, light reflections, and fading film. But this was different. This felt alive. The boy in the image was not just some forgotten child of history. There was something else in his expression, something too deliberate, too aware. Without a word, Elellanar clicked a few more buttons on the scanner, adjusting the contrast. What she saw next made her breath hitch in her throat. The boy's figure began to shift again, his smile widening unnaturally. But it wasn't just that. Something else was emerging from the shadows at the edges of the photograph. A figure, barely visible at first, began to solidify. The edges of the figure were blurry at first, indistinct, but then they sharpened, revealing a shape that seemed out of place in the photograph's otherwise Victorian setting. "James, look," Elellanar whispered. "Do you see it? There's someone else in the photo." James stepped closer, his skepticism slowly turning into something akin to curiosity. He stared at the screen for a long moment, his brow furrowing. "That wasn't there before," he said slowly. "I swear I didn't see it." The figure in the photograph was now unmistakable. It was a woman, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend into the background. Her face was obscured by the shadow, but her eyes were wide open, staring directly at them, almost as if she were silently begging for help. Elellanar's pulse quickened, and a cold wave washed over her. There was a long pause before James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not possible. How could that figure have appeared now? The photo was fine before." Elellanar couldn't answer him. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. There was no logical explanation. The photograph was old, but it wasn't supposed to be alive. The figure of the woman in the background, the shifting boy's face, it all pointed to something far darker than a mere historical oddity. "I'm going to try something," Elellanar said, her voice steady despite the rising dread. She clicked a few more buttons, adjusting the image's resolution and settings to sharpen the focus on the woman's figure. The moment she did, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. A chill swept through the air, cutting through her thin sweater. She shivered involuntarily, but pressed on, trying to keep her focus on the image. As the woman's figure became clearer, something horrifying happened. The boy's smile twisted, no longer innocent, but wide, grotesque, and full of malice. His eyes, those cold, dark eyes, shifted from Elellanar's direction to James's. For a split second, it felt as though the boy was standing right in front of them. A strange, unnatural sound filled the room, almost like a faint whisper, too quiet to make out the words, but unmistakably present. It was as if the voices were coming from deep within the photograph itself, echoing from another time. James recoiled, stumbling back from the desk. That wasn't just a glitch, was it? It's like the photo's alive. Elellanar didn't answer him. She was transfixed, her eyes locked on the boy in the image. There was something else now. As the shadows around the boy and the woman in the photograph deepened, more details began to emerge. The mansion behind them, once just a dark, imposing backdrop, was now showing signs of damage. Cracks appeared in the walls, and there was an unsettling smell in the air, like something had been burning. "What's happening to it?" Elellanar muttered, barely aware of her own voice. Her hand hovered above the scanner, trembling. "I think we need to stop," James said, his voice shaking. "We shouldn't be doing this. Whatever this is, it's not right." But Elellanar wasn't listening. She couldn't. She had to know more. The figure in the photograph was no longer just a mystery. It was a puzzle that had been waiting to be solved. And now it was reaching out, trying to pull them into its world. The photograph had changed everything. What had started as an innocent investigation into an old image had quickly transformed into something far more dangerous and unsettling. Elellanar's heart raced as she stared at the screen, the boy's shifting smile haunting her thoughts. But it was the woman in the background that truly terrified her. Those wide eyes, staring back at her, pleading silently for something. What did she want? What had happened to her? James stood beside her, his face pale, a mix of disbelief and fear evident on his features. This is beyond anything I've ever seen. The photo, it's not just an image. There's something else in it. Something real. I need to know who they were, Elellanar said, her voice barely a whisper. Why is this photograph so powerful? James didn't respond, but the fear in his eyes was enough to show that he agreed. Elellanar knew they had crossed a line, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to uncover the truth. The image, the figures within it, none of it made sense. And the more she looked, the more it felt like something had been waiting for her to find it. That night, Elellanar stayed late in the Historical Society's archives, poring through old records. James had left, too rattled to continue, but Elellanar's obsession had only deepened. She dug through countless articles, historical documents, and local news clippings, hoping for any mention of the photograph or the boy. But every piece of information she uncovered only led to more questions. Then, as the clock struck midnight, she came across an article that caught her attention. It was buried deep within a stack of old newspapers, barely legible. The ink faded from years of neglect. The headline read, "Fire at Blackwood Orphanage claims the lives of 27 children. One boy missing." Elellanar's breath caught in her throat as she read the date, March 18th, 1897. She quickly scanned the article. It spoke of a fire that had torn through the Blackwood Orphanage late at night, killing 27 children who had been sleeping in their dormitory. The orphanage, a massive Gothic building located just outside town, had been home to some of the most vulnerable children in the area. The fire had been swift, and the majority of the children had perished before they could escape. But there was one child who hadn't been accounted for. One boy who had been in the photograph. "That's him," Elellanar whispered to herself, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. The boy in the photo had been at the orphanage. He had survived the fire, or had he? The article went on to say that the boy's name was Samuel Blackwood, the son of the orphanage's founder, Charles Blackwood. Samuel had been seen outside the orphanage just before the fire started, but no one had known where he went afterward. His body was never recovered. "I should have known," Elellanar murmured, her mind reeling with the implications. The boy, Samuel Blackwood, had been lost to history, his disappearance a mystery that had never been solved. But the photograph had been waiting for her, holding the key to the truth all along. Ellenar's hands shook as she continued to read the article, her mind connecting the dots. According to local reports, the fire had been blamed on a faulty furnace, but some had whispered that there was more to the story. Rumors of arson and foul play had circulated in the town, though they had never been confirmed. The orphanage had been devastated by the fire, and with it, the lives of many children had been lost. But what about Samuel? Why had he disappeared? Why had no one seen him again? The article mentioned a second tragedy that followed the fire. Charles Blackwood, devastated by the loss of his son and the destruction of the orphanage, had reportedly gone mad with grief. He spent years searching for Samuel, convinced that his son was still alive, but no trace of the boy was ever found. After Charles's death, the orphanage was abandoned and eventually forgotten. The once grand building had been torn down, its remnants lost to time. But what if Samuel hadn't died in the fire? What if, somehow, he had survived, only to vanish, his fate sealed in the very photograph that now haunted Elellanar? The more she read, the more she realized that Samuel's disappearance wasn't just a random tragedy. It was part of something much darker, something tied to the forces that had shaped the boy's life. The fire, the missing boy, the whispers of foul play, all of it was now connected to the photograph she was holding. And the woman who had appeared behind him, the one with the pleading eyes, what role did she play in all of this? Elellanar stood up, her mind racing with new questions. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. But as she stared at the photograph of Samuel, the shadows in the background seemed to grow darker, as though they were pulling him back into the past, back into the fire that had consumed everything. "James," Elellanar said aloud, her voice steady now, "we're not just uncovering a forgotten history. We're unearthing something much more dangerous. The boy in this photograph is more than just a victim. He's part of a larger story, and I'm afraid that story isn't finished yet." The next morning, Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. As she sat at her desk, the photograph of Samuel Blackwood stared back at her from the screen, his unsettling smile frozen in time. The more she stared at his face, the more she was certain of one thing. The boy in the photograph wasn't just part of history. He was still tied to the present. She couldn't explain it, but every inch of her being screamed that the boy was trying to tell her something. His eyes, which had first appeared lifeless, now seemed full of intent, as though he was begging her to uncover the truth about his fate. The image that had once seemed so still was now a ticking time bomb, with its secrets buried deep within. Elellanar reached for the mouse, zooming in on the boy's face once more. This time, as she adjusted the resolution, the image seemed to react differently. The shadows behind Samuel began to shift, subtle at first, but unmistakable. The shadows now seemed to move around his figure like they were alive and restless, as though they were trying to pull him deeper into the image, or perhaps out of it entirely. Her fingers hovered over the mouse as she zoomed in further. The boy's expression remained unchanged, yet his eyes glimmered with something darker, something that wasn't there before. It wasn't just the smile, it was the whole atmosphere of the photograph. Everything about it felt different now. "This is insane," she muttered to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. How could a photograph, a mere piece of history, suddenly feel like a window into another world? The more Elellanar looked at the image, the more it felt like the boy in the photograph wasn't just a victim of the fire. There was something about the way his face had been captured, something about the background shadows that made her feel like he was more than just a child lost to time. It was as if Samuel had been caught between two worlds, one of the living and one of the dead, unable to move on. She couldn't help but feel that his story was far from over, that the boy was reaching out to her, urging her to understand something about his life, his death, and the photograph itself. But what? Elellanar took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The room around her felt suffocating, the silence pressing down on her as the boy's eyes seemed to grow heavier. There was a distinct sense of unease, a feeling that she wasn't alone in the room. But when she glanced around, she saw nothing but the stacks of old files and the dim light of the single desk lamp. But the feeling remained. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Ellenar's heart skipped a beat as she quickly turned, startled by the sound. James stood in the doorway, looking uneasy. "Sorry to interrupt, but I think you should see this," he said, holding up an old journal. "I found something else. Something that might explain what we're dealing with here." Elellanar stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "What is it?" James placed the journal on the desk. It was old, its leather cover cracked with age, but it looked like it had been handled recently. The edges of the pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was still legible. Ellenar's fingers hovered over it as she slowly opened the cover. As she read the first few lines, her breath caught in her throat. The boy in the photograph is not just a ghost, not just a memory. He is a tethered soul, forever trapped between worlds. The curse of the Blackwood family is real. Samuel's death was no accident. He was marked long before the fire. And the photograph, it holds his spirit captive. Ellenar's mind raced as she read the journal entry again. The boy she had been studying so intently, wasn't just a victim. He had been cursed, marked by something dark long before the fire that took so many lives. His death, or what had happened to him afterward, was far from an ordinary tragedy. There was something else at play, something that kept him bound to the photograph. She could feel her pulse quicken as she turned the pages of the journal, her hands trembling. The next few pages were filled with frantic scribbles, talking about rituals, curses, and unfinished business. But one line stood out, written in bold letters that almost seemed to burn into the page. "To free the boy, you must confront what has been locked away for generations." The words sent a shiver down Ellenar's spine. Free the boy? What did that mean? Was the boy trying to communicate with her because he was trapped? And if so, what had he been locked away from? "James," Elellanar said, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been looking at this all wrong. It's not just about the fire. Samuel's story, it's connected to something much darker. Something that's been haunting this town long before the orphanage burned down." James stepped closer, his face pale. "What do you mean?" Elellanar looked back at the photograph on her screen. The boy's smile seemed wider now, more menacing. The shadows around him pulsed, like they were alive, waiting for something. "I think Samuel's spirit is trapped," Elellanar said, her voice shaking. "And the only way to help him is to uncover the truth of his death and what really happened that night." The moment the words from the journal sank in, the room seemed to grow heavier. Elellanar could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, almost suffocating in its intensity. The shadows in the room shifted as though responding to her growing unease. The figure in the photograph, the boy, Samuel Blackwood, felt more present than ever. It was as if the image was no longer just a relic of the past. It had come alive. Ellenar's fingers hovered over the mouse, zooming in once again on the boy's face. His eyes seemed to follow her more closely now, their gaze locked onto her in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. But something else had changed. A subtle flicker appeared at the edges of the image, shadows moving like liquid, stretching outward from the boy's figure, encroaching into the frame. "James," Elellanar said, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't take her eyes off the screen. "Look at this." James, who had been leaning against the doorway, stepped forward cautiously. His face was pale, and Elellanar could see the skepticism fading in his eyes. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Elellanar didn't answer. Instead, she zoomed in even further, watching the shadows creep closer, inching toward the center of the image. The boy's smile had twisted again, becoming almost grotesque in its unnaturalness. His once faint grin had now become an eerie, knowing smirk, as though he were privy to a dark secret. It was no longer a simple portrait. It was a warning. Just then, the lights above them flickered, the room plunging into darkness for a split second before the bulbs returned to life. Ellenar's pulse quickened. The air in the room had grown frigid. She glanced around, noticing the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should have. Crawling along the walls, stretching toward the corners, and enveloping the space in an unnatural darkness. "That's not possible," James muttered, rubbing his eyes as though trying to rid himself of an illusion. "We're in the basement. There's no way for the shadows to move like this." But Elellanar wasn't listening to him. She had already pushed her chair back from the desk and stood, her gaze fixed on the photograph. She could feel a presence now, something beyond the photograph itself, something ancient. It was as if the very room had transformed into a vessel for something else, something that had been waiting to be noticed. She reached out, touching the screen, her fingers trembling as she ran them across the boy's face. The temperature in the room dropped, the cold biting into her skin. The whispering sound she had heard earlier, a faint, inaudible murmur, was growing louder, and this time, she could almost make out the words. "Help me!" The voice was distant, faint, but undeniably there. The whisper seemed to echo from the photograph itself, as if the boy was speaking through it, calling out to her. A shiver ran down her spine. She looked at James, who now stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. James nodded, his face grim. "I heard it, but there's no way, this is impossible. We've been working with this photo for hours, and now it's like it's alive." Elellanar didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to the image. The shadows around the boy were now fully formed, no longer merely faint distortions. They had become thick, inky tendrils, wrapping around him like chains. The longer she stared, the more it seemed as if the boy was trapped in the photograph, his very soul imprisoned by the dark forces that had woven themselves into the image. A loud thud echoed from behind her. Elellanar jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She whipped around, expecting to see something, anything. An intruder, a shadow, some explanation for the sounds she was hearing. But there was nothing. The whispering returned, this time louder, more insistent. "Help me! Release me!" The voice seemed to be coming from within the photograph now, growing stronger, more desperate. "James, I think he's trying to tell us something," Elellanar said, her voice barely a whisper. James took a hesitant step back. "This is insane. What do we even do now? We're not supposed to be messing with things like this." But Elellanar didn't hear him. She was already reaching for the journal again, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. There had to be something more, something that could explain the figure in the photo, the voices, the shadows. The boy, Samuel Blackwood, was reaching out to her, trying to tell her something important. She could feel it in her bones. "Samuel, you were trapped," Elellanar murmured, more to herself than to James. "But why? What happened to you?" Just then, the photograph on the screen shifted. The boy's smile widened unnaturally, and his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, like something deep inside him had awakened. Elellanar recoiled, but she couldn't look away. It was as though the boy was alive within the photo, his spirit reaching out, desperate to break free. The room felt colder still, the shadows now wrapping around her, tightening like a noose. As she stared at the image, the boy's face seemed to distort further, warping into something darker, something twisted. And just before the lights flickered again, Elellanar realized whatever was happening, whatever had been triggered by this photograph, was only just beginning. Elellanar couldn't take her eyes off the screen. The boy's face, Samuel Blackwood, was no longer a mere image. It had become a manifestation, pulling her into his world, one she couldn't escape from. His eyes locked with hers, his expression twisted, not just in a smile but in something far more sinister. His figure no longer looked trapped in time. It was as if he were reaching out of the photo itself, attempting to cross the boundary between the two worlds. Behind her, The shadows in the basement seemed to grow, creeping along the walls like living things, twisting and writhing as if in response to the energy that had suddenly been awakened. The temperature in the room plummeted again. Elellanar could see her breath misting in the air, her skin tingling with the cold, but it was more than just physical discomfort. It was the sensation of being watched, of being pulled into something she couldn't control. "James!" she cried, her voice high and frantic. "Get away from the photo. This isn't just a photograph. He's alive in there." James, still standing in the doorway, looked at her with wide eyes. His expression was a mixture of confusion and fear, but Elellanar could see he was starting to believe her now. The whispering had grown louder, more frantic. "Help me! Release me!" The voice echoed through the room, and with each repetition, it grew stronger. Elellanar stood frozen for a moment, staring at the boy, who now appeared to be moving within the photograph. His eyes didn't just follow her. They tracked her, as if he were shifting within the frame, trying to break free. The shadows, once subtle, now surged around him like a dark mist, pressing into the edges of the photo, seemingly feeding off the tension in the room. The whispering was so loud now that it felt as though it was coming from every direction, from the very walls themselves. "James?" Elellanar breathed, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong. It's not just about the fire. Samuel wasn't the only one trapped in the photograph. The house, the shadows, everything. It's all connected." "What are you saying?" James asked, his voice shaking. "That photo, that thing, it's a doorway? A portal?" Elellanar nodded slowly, her breath shallow. "The boy, Samuel, he's trapped in there. But it's not just him. It's his spirit, his soul, and the darkness that's tied to him. The photograph, it's more than just a memory. It's a prison." James stepped closer, his gaze flickering between Elellanar and the image on the screen. "So, what now? How do we stop this? How do we—" Before he could finish, the photograph on the screen flickered violently. The boy's smile twisted again, stretching impossibly wide across his face, and his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart around them. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, like the sound of glass shattering, but it wasn't coming from the screen. Elellanar turned, her heart leaping into her throat, as the sound seemed to come from behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her chest, and gasped. The photograph on the desk, the real, physical photograph, had begun to crack. Tiny fissures appeared in the glass, spreading out like spider webs. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the surface, a sharp, freezing sensation shot through her hand, causing her to jerk back in pain. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chaotic, overlapping chorus, filling the room with voices. Some of them sounded human, others were distorted, like the voices of the long dead, trapped between the worlds. The air was thick with energy, the shadows pressing in from all directions, almost as though the room itself was becoming part of the photograph. James stumbled backward, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" Elellanar couldn't answer him. Her mind was racing, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process everything happening in front of her. The photograph was no longer just an image. It was a portal, a bridge between their world and something much darker. And Samuel, he was the key. But what did he want? What was he trying to communicate? Suddenly, she realized it. The boy had never truly left the photograph. His soul, his very essence, was bound to it. But there was more. The figure of the woman, the one who had appeared behind him in the image, was not just another spirit trapped in the same photograph. She was the one who had caused the tragedy. She was the key to his imprisonment. Elellanar looked at James, her voice filled with urgency. "We need to find out who she is. She's the one who cursed him. She's the reason his soul is trapped here." The photograph continued to crack, the shadows becoming more defined, stretching out and reaching toward them. The figure in the background, the woman, was now becoming clearer in the image. She had a twisted expression, almost as if she were relishing in the torment she had caused. Her eyes, just like Samuel's, seemed to pierce through time itself, locking onto Elellanar with an unnerving intensity. "I can't stay here," James said, his voice frantic. "We need to leave now. This thing isn't just a picture. It's pulling us in." But Elellanar was already moving, her gaze fixed on the photograph. She knew they were running out of time. Samuel's spirit was becoming more desperate with each passing second. If she didn't act now, the darkness would consume them both. As the room grew colder, and the whispering voices turned into an overwhelming roar, Elellanar realized that the only way to save them all was to finish the boy's story, to uncover the full truth and break the curse that had held him prisoner for so long. But to do that, she had to enter the photograph. Elellanar's breath was ragged as she stood before the photograph, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows had grown darker, the whispers louder, but still, she couldn't pull herself away. The boy, Samuel, was trapped in the image, his spirit bound to it, and she could feel his anguish as though it were her own. The photograph was no longer just a piece of history. It had become a living entity, a conduit to a world of torment and sorrow. She had to finish what had been started so long ago. James stood a few steps behind her, his eyes wide with fear as the darkness around them grew more oppressive. The temperature in the room had dropped so drastically that it was hard to breathe. "Elellanar, you need to get away from that thing," he urged, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers. "This isn't just a ghost story. Whatever is happening, it's real, and it's getting worse." But Elellanar didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the photograph on the boy's face. His expression, once a smile, had now shifted into something mournful, filled with sorrow and regret. She could feel his pain, could sense the pull of the shadows around him, the weight of the curse that had bound him to the image for over a century. The figure of the woman in the background, the one who had caused all of this, was now clearer than ever. Her face twisted with malice, her eyes filled with contempt. It was as if she were waiting for Elellanar to act, daring her to break the cycle. But Elellanar knew the truth now. The boy's spirit was bound to the photograph by the woman's cruelty. She had been the one who had caused his death, the one who had cursed him to remain in this world, trapped between the living and the dead. Elellanar stepped closer to the photograph, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. "I'm sorry, Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The room grew colder still, but Elellanar didn't flinch. She knew what she had to do. The boy, Samuel, had never truly been at peace. He had been lost, abandoned by both the world and the people who were supposed to protect him. But now, Elellanar had the chance to set him free, to release his soul from the prison of the photograph. With a deep breath, Elellanar placed her hand on the image. The moment her fingers made contact with the glass, a shock of cold rushed through her, sending a jolt of energy through her entire body. The air around her grew thick, and the shadows surrounding the boy seemed to swirl violently, as though they were fighting against her. But she didn't pull away. She held her ground, closing her eyes as she focused on the boy's spirit, reaching out to him across the gap between their worlds. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice steady now, "you're not alone anymore. It's over. You can rest now." For a moment, everything went still. The whispering voices stopped, the shadows receded, and the temperature in the room slowly began to rise. Elellanar felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace that seemed to wash over the room like sunlight breaking through a stormy sky. And then, she felt it, a shift. The boy's presence, which had been so overpowering, began to fade, slowly at first, then more quickly, as though he were being pulled away from the photograph, from the darkness that had held him captive for so long. His face softened, his smile, what little was left of it, became gentle, peaceful. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, were now calm. The shadows around the photograph dissipated completely, leaving only the image of the boy, standing alone but no longer trapped. Elellanar held her breath, her hand still resting on the photograph, waiting. And then it was done. The photograph, once alive with energy and dark power, returned to being just an image. The boy was gone, his spirit finally released from its prison. Ellenar's heart swelled with a quiet relief. It was over. Samuel Blackwood was free. James stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice shaky. Is he gone?" Elellanar nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the now-still photograph. "He's at peace. It's over." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight in the room had lifted, and though the shadows remained in the corners, they no longer held the same oppressive force. The atmosphere had changed. It was no longer one of fear, but of closure, a resolution that had been long overdue. As Elellanar turned away from the photograph, a sense of quiet satisfaction filled her. She had uncovered the truth, had faced the darkness, and had set the boy's spirit free. Samuel Blackwood was no longer a mystery, no longer a ghost trapped between worlds. He was at rest. James looked at her, his eyes wide. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You really did it." Elellanar gave a small, tired smile. "We did it." As they left the basement together, the photograph remained, now a silent reminder of the boy who had been lost to time and the one person who had finally set him free. As Elellanar stood at the top of the stairs, looking back at the basement door where the photograph once lay, she felt a sense of quiet finality. The boy's spirit was free, and the mystery that had haunted Westbrook for over a century was finally solved. The air in the building had shifted, as if the weight of a long-forgotten tragedy had been lifted, leaving the place with a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. James stood beside her, his arms crossed, still processing everything that had happened. "I can't believe it," he said softly. "After all these years, we finally know the truth." Elellanar nodded, her eyes still fixed on the basement door. "It feels surreal, but the truth was always there, waiting to be uncovered." They had solved the mystery of Samuel Blackwood's disappearance, a mystery that had been buried under the ashes of the fire and the years that followed. The boy who had been trapped in time, forever frozen in the photograph, had been released. His spirit was no longer bound by the darkness that had claimed him all those years ago. But Elellanar couldn't shake the feeling that their work wasn't done. The photograph, the boy's story, it had left a mark on her, one that wouldn't fade so easily. She had always believed in history's power to shape the present. But now, she realized that some stories were more than just facts. They were living things waiting to be remembered. She turned to James, a thoughtful expression on her face. "This story needs to be shared," she said quietly. "People need to know what happened here. Not just the fire, but the boy, Samuel, everything." James raised an eyebrow, then nodded in agreement. "You're right. It's too important to be forgotten." Elellanar smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "We'll make sure the world knows. Samuel's story will be told. And maybe, just maybe, he'll finally be able to rest in peace." As they walked away from the basement, leaving the darkness behind them, Elellanar couldn't help but think about all the forgotten souls out there. Those lost to time, those trapped in photographs, and those whose stories had never been heard. But Samuel was one of the lucky ones. His story had been told, and he had found his peace. For now, that was enough.